Good morning, everybody. I'm going to read you a story today called Dogger. Dogger is quite an old story now. I used to read it to my children when they were little. It was written by a lady called Shirley Hughes, and she was also the illustrator of this story. So the pictures and the words are both by Shirley Hughes. It's called Dogger. Just get comfortable. Okay, here he is. Once there was a soft brown toy called Dogger. One of his ears pointed upwards and the other flopped over. His fur was worn in places because he was quite old. He belonged to Dave. Dave was very fond of Dogger. He took him everywhere. Sometimes he gave him rides in a trolley. Sometimes he pulled him along on a piece of string, like a real dog. And when it was cold, he wrapped him up in a bit of blanket. Now and again, Dave's mum said that Dogger was getting much too dirty. So she showed Dave how to wash him in a bowl of soapy water, and then they hung him up by his tail on the washing line to dry. Dave's baby brother Joe liked hard toys. He liked putting them in his mouth and biting on them, and that's because he was getting teeth. Dave's big sister Bella took 7 teddies to bed with her every night. She had to sleep right up against the wall to stop herself from falling out. But Dave only liked Dogger. One afternoon, Dave and Mum set out to collect Bella from the school. Mum took Joe in the pushchair and Dave took Dogger. Next to the school gate where the mums and dads waited was a playing field. Some men with ladders were putting up coloured flags. Mum said that there was going to be a summer fair to get money to buy things for the school. Dave pushed Dogger up against the railings to show him what was going on. Just then, the children started to come out from school. Bella came running round the corner with her satchel flying in the air, and at the same moment, an ice cream van arrived, playing a tune. Can we have an ice cream, Mum? Please, it's Friday. It's the last day of the week. Mum gave her the money for 2 cones. Now, Joe didn't have a whole cone to himself because he was so dribbly. On the way home, Dave walked beside the pushchair, giving Joe licks of his ice cream. And in between those licks, Joe would kick his feet about, shouting, more, more, more. At tea time, Dave was rather quiet. At bedtime, he was even quieter. And in the end, he said in a quiet voice, I want Dogger. But Dogger was nowhere to be found. Mum looked under the bed. She looked behind the cupboard. She looked in the cupboard under the stairs. But he was not there. She searched the kitchen to no avail. Bella joined in too. She turned out her own toy box in case Dogger was in there, but he wasn't. When Dad came home from work, he went out into the garden with a torch and looked in the shed and down the garden path. But he was not to be found. He was quite lost. Dave was very sad when he finally went to bed that night. Bella kindly lent him her teddy to try and get to sleep with, but it was not the same thing as Dogger, and Dave kept waking in the night and missing him. The next day was Saturday, the day of the school summer fair, and they all went to have a look. The playing field was full of stalls and sideshows. There was a fancy dress parade. Can you see all those different children and how they're dressed up? Doctor Who's Dalek, I've got a pirate, a clown, an angel, or a fairy rather, all sorts. Then there were sports, with an egg and spoon race, a wheelbarrow race, and a dad's race. Bella was very good at races. She won the three-legged race with her friend Barbara. Wouldn't you like to go in for a race? They asked Dave. But Dave didn't feel like racing. He was missing Dogger too much. And then another exciting thing happened to Bella. She won first prize in the raffle. The prize was a huge yellow teddy. It had a great big blue silk bow around its neck. He was almost as big as Dave. Dave didn't like that teddy much. And he didn't like Bella very much at that moment either, because she kept winning things and he'd lost Dogger. He went off on his own to look at the stalls. One lady had a stall full of toys, knitted ducks, cars, dolls in bonnets, toys that children had given because they had grown out of them. And there, at the very back of the stall, behind a lot of other toys, was Dogger. He was wearing a ticket saying 5p. There were a lot of people round the stall. Dave tried to explain to the lady that it was his Dogger who'd got lost and somehow been put on the stall by mistake. But she was too busy to listen. He looked in his pocket. He had 3p, but that wasn't enough. He ran to find Mum and Dad to ask them to buy Dogger back at once. He went everywhere in the crowd, but Dave could not find Mum and Dad. He thought he was going to cry. At last, he found Bella by the cakes. When she heard about Dogger, she and Dave ran back to the toy store as fast as they could. But something terrible had happened. Dogger had just been bought by a little girl, and she was walking off with him already. Dave began to cry. Bella ran after the little girl and tried to explain that Dogger really belonged to her brother Dave. Could they please buy him back? But the little girl said, "No, I bought him with my own money and I want him." And she held on to him very tightly. Dave cried and cried. And then the little girl started to cry too. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted Bella's new big yellow teddy. She stopped crying and put out her hand to stroke him and his beautiful blue silk bow. Then Bella did something very kind. "Would you swap this teddy for my brother's dog then?" she asked. Ooh, right away, the little girl stopped crying completely and began to smile. She held out Dogger to Dave, took the big teddy in her arms instead, and went off with him. And then Dave smiled too. He hugged Dogger and he hugged Bella round the waist. "Thank you, Bella," he said. I think he was lucky to have such a fantastic and kind big sister. Very Kedrick kind. That night, Dave had Dogger in bed beside him. Bella was practicing somersaults. "Shall you miss that big teddy?" Dave asked her. "No," said Bella. "I didn't like him much, really. He was too big and his eyes were too staring. And anyway, if I had another teddy in my bed, there wouldn't be room for me." And that is how they ended up that night, fast asleep, tucked up in bed with their own teddies. And that is the end of the story of Dogger. I wonder if you've ever lost one of your most precious toys. Can you remember how it felt? I will see you tomorrow. Thank you for joining me.